The jungle was alive with a relentless hum, the air thick with humidity and tension. Neon blue vines coiled around ancient trees, their leaves glowing faintly in the dim light. Bioluminescent insects flitted between dense foliage, their movements erratic and frenzied. Every sound, every flash of motion, felt like a warning. This planet, designated Aerith 7, was no sanctuary. It was a test, and humanity's colonists were failing. Max Carter crouched low behind a jagged boulder, his breath shallow as he adjusted his cracked glasses. He was painfully aware of his own heartbeat, hammering in his ears like a war drum. Around him, a team of heavily armed soldiers scanned the shadows, their movements precise and methodical. Max had no weapon, no armor, just a datapad clutched tightly in his shaking hands. His role on Aerith 7 was clear: observe, document, and survive. Survival, however, was proving to be a monumental challenge. "You're in the way again, Carter," barked Lieutenant Daniels, his tone sharp with impatience. Daniels was everything Max wasn't: broad-shouldered, decisive, and unyieldingly confident. The lieutenant's scarred face and steady gaze marked him as a man who thrived under pressure, a stark contrast to Max's wiry frame and perpetually anxious demeanor. "Sorry," Max muttered, stepping aside, his cheeks flushed with embarrassment as the soldiers swept past him, their boots crunching softly against the mossy ground. He hated feeling useless, but he couldn't deny the truth. He didn't belong here. Aerith 7 had been humanity's chance to expand, to prove their worth among the stars. The galaxy teemed with intelligent species, most of them physically superior to humans in every conceivable way. To them, humans were the weakest creatures in existence, a species relying on tools and numbers to compensate for their frailty. It was a reputation Max had grown used to, though it stung every time he saw it reinforced. As the group pressed deeper into the jungle, the atmosphere grew heavier. The air carried an acrid scent that Max couldn't place, but it unsettled him. He tapped nervously on his datapad, trying to focus on cataloging the flora around them. His notes were thorough, filled with observations about the alien plants and their potential uses. But even as he worked, a creeping sense of dread gnawed at him. "Eyes up!" Daniel's voice cut through the silence like a blade. The soldiers froze, their weapons raised. Max strained to see what had caught the lieutenant's attention, but the jungle was a labyrinth of shadows and shifting light. Then he saw it. At first, it was just a shape, a hulking figure moving with unnatural grace between the trees. Its body was obscured by the dense undergrowth, but the brief glimpses Max caught were enough to chill him to the core. Glossy black armor covered its frame, segmented like the carapace of a beetle. It moved silently, its limbs unervingly long and agile. The apex predator had arrived. Panic rippled through the group. Daniel signaled for the soldiers to spread out, their formation tightening as they prepared for the inevitable confrontation. Max stumbled backward, his datapad nearly slipping from his grasp. He had heard the stories about the apex, how it was the ultimate hunter, a creature engineered by evolution to dominate any environment. It was fast, cunning, and utterly lethal. "Stay behind me," one of the younger soldiers muttered, positioning himself between Max and the approaching predator. His voice carried a tremor of fear, and Max felt a pang of guilt. These men and women were risking their lives while he contributed nothing of value. The first attack came without warning, a blur of movement, and the soldier nearest to the apex was gone, his scream cut short by a sickening crunch. Chaos erupted as the team opened fire, the jungle flashing with bursts of energy weapons. The apex darted between them, its speed defying comprehension. Bullets and plasma blasts ricocheted harmlessly off its armored hide. Max could only watch, paralyzed by fear, as the predator dismantled the group with terrifying efficiency. Its strikes were precise, each movement calculated to maximize destruction. Within moments, the once organized team was reduced to a scattering of panicked individuals. "Run!" Daniel shouted, his voice hoarse as he emptied his weapon into the apex. The creature turned toward him, its eyes glowing faintly as it assessed its prey. Max didn't need to be told twice. He bolted, his legs burning as he sprinted through the jungle. Branches clawed at his face, and his lungs felt like they might burst, but he didn't dare stop. Behind him, the sounds of combat grew fainter, replaced by the haunting silence of the jungle reclaiming its domain. When he finally collapsed against a tree, gasping for air, Max's mind raced. The apex was unstoppable, a force of nature that no weapon could defeat. But as his fear began to subside, a thought took root in his mind. Fragile and unlikely, but persistent. Perhaps strength alone wouldn't defeat the apex. Perhaps there was another way. Max stared at his trembling hands. The datapad still clutched tightly between them. He didn't have the muscles or the weapons to fight a predator, but he had something else. Knowledge. And if humanity was to survive, that knowledge might be the only thing standing between them and extinction. With that thought, he stood and began to plan. The jungle was quiet, but not peacefully so. It was the silence of a predator's domain, where prey dared not stir lest it draw attention. Max Carter crouched in the shadow of an enormous tree, its roots gnarled and twisted like the hands of an ancient giant. His heart pounded, each beat reminding him of how little time he had. Somewhere nearby, the apex predator was hunting. Max's fingers moved with frantic precision over the screen of his datapad. Sweat dripped down his temple, stinging his eyes, but he ignored it. The datapad displayed a map of the surrounding terrain, marked with glowing points where he'd set traps. The points formed a crude ring, enclosing the area where he hoped to draw the creature. "This has to work," he whispered to himself. "It has to." Max had spent the last 2 days studying the apex from a distance, observing its movements and patterns. It was unlike anything he'd ever encountered. Intelligent, adaptive, and seemingly indestructible. Its segmented armor deflected bullets and plasma alike, and its reflexes allowed it to evade even the deadliest traps the colonists had devised. Yet, despite its dominance, Max had noticed something. The apex relied heavily on its heightened senses. Its vision, smell, and hearing were far beyond human capability. That reliance made it predictable in some ways, and Max intended to exploit that. The first step was to lure it into his chosen battleground. He had scavenged supplies from the ruined colony outposts and combined them with the strange, dangerous flora of Aerith 7. Pheromone-laden plants served as bait, their scents irresistible to the predator. Other traps were less subtle. Hidden pits lined with sharpened stakes, clusters of explosive spores rigged to detonate on contact. But Max knew none of this would be enough on its own. The apex had survived the colonists' best efforts. It would adapt just as quickly to his. He needed a way to deliver a killing blow, and that meant getting closer to the creature than anyone had ever dared. Max pulled a small vial from his pocket, the liquid inside shimmering faintly. It was a concentrated toxin extracted from one of Aerith 7's carnivorous plants, a substance so potent that even a few drops could paralyze a creature 10 times his size. He had coated the tip of a makeshift spear with it, the weapon little more than a sharpened length of alien bone. The sound of rustling foliage snapped Max's attention back to the present. His chest tightened as he scanned the jungle around him, searching for any sign of movement. A faint clicking noise echoed through the air, low and rhythmic. The apex was close. Max forced himself to breathe steadily. Fear wouldn't help him now. He activated a small device on his belt, releasing a burst of sound at a frequency too high for human ears to detect. It was a decoy, designed to mimic the distress calls of Aerith 7's smaller prey. The jungle held its breath. Then a shadow moved. The apex emerged from the undergrowth with a fluidity that was almost hypnotic. Its sleek, Black armor reflected the dim bioluminescent light, and its elongated limbs carried it forward with a predator's grace. Max felt a surge of primal terror as its glowing eyes swept the area, scanning for the source of the sound. It moved toward one of the pheromone traps, its nostrils flaring. Max watched as it hesitated, the alien intelligence behind its gaze evident. The trap triggered with a muffled explosion, releasing a cloud of sticky spores that clung to the creature's armor. The apex roared, a guttural, bone-rattling sound, but it didn't flee. It was learning. Max swallowed hard. The traps were working, but not for long. The creature would adapt, just as it always did. He tightened his grip on the spear, its toxin-coated tip gleaming faintly. The apex advanced, shaking off the spores with a violent shudder. Its movements were slower now, the trap's effects taking hold. Max saw his opportunity and stepped into the open. "Over here!" he shouted, his voice cracking. The apex's head snapped toward him, its glowing eyes narrowing. For a moment, it seemed to hesitate, as if puzzled by the audacity of its prey. Then it charged, moving with terrifying speed despite its injuries. Max's world narrowed to the creature barreling toward him. He held his ground until the last possible second, then dove to the side, narrowly avoiding the razor-sharp claws that slashed through the air where he'd stood. The apex skidded, its momentum carrying it into another trap, a pit lined with stakes. The stakes didn't pierce its armor, but the fall disoriented it. Max scrambled to his feet, his breath ragged. He climbed onto the edge of the pit, raising the spear. The apex roared again, thrashing as it tried to free itself. Max leaped, driving the spear into the exposed joint at the creature's neck. The toxin worked almost instantly, spreading through the predator's body and paralyzing it. The apex's struggles weakened, its movements slowing until it lay still. Max collapsed beside the pit, his chest heaving. He stared at the fallen creature, disbelief washing over him. Against all odds, he had done it. But as he sat there, the jungle seemed to grow darker, more oppressive. Max knew this wasn't the end, only the beginning of a much larger battle. If the apex was truly dead, then perhaps humanity could reclaim Aerith 7. But if it wasn't, Max pushed himself to his feet, determination hardening in his eyes. One battle might be won, but the war for survival was far from over. The apex predator lay motionless in the pit, its sleek, black carapace marred by the sticky residue of alien spores and the venom coursing through its veins. Max Carter stood above it, leaning on the crude spear that had brought the creature down. His chest heaved as he gulped in air, his muscles trembling with exhaustion. Yet, despite the scene before him, he couldn't bring himself to celebrate. The jungle around him had grown eerily silent, as if the death of its apex inhabitant had stolen the life from it. The oppressive hum of insects was gone, and the bioluminescent plants no longer seemed as vibrant. The quiet felt less like victory and more like the aftermath of a storm. Unsettling, unnatural. Max wiped the sweat from his brow with a shaky hand, staring at the creature in the pit. Even in death, it was a terrifying sight. Its massive body was a masterpiece of evolutionary engineering. Armored plates interlocked perfectly, muscles coiled with explosive potential, and limbs designed for speed and precision. This was a predator that had slaughtered a dozen colonists in minutes, torn through barricades and shrugged off bullets. And yet, Max, a man with no combat experience, no remarkable strength and no formal training, had brought it down. The irony wasn't lost on him, but the cost had been steep. The faces of the fallen colonists flashed in his mind. Lieutenant Daniels, with his unyielding confidence, had stood his ground until the very end. The younger soldiers who had shielded Max, their courage unbroken despite their fear. Each of them had fought to protect humanity's fragile foothold on Aerith 7, and each had paid the ultimate price. Max swallowed hard, his throat tight. He hadn't saved them. He hadn't been able to. Strength doesn't always win, he murmured, his voice hoarse. The words sounded hollow, even to him. He turned his attention back to the apex. The venom had done its job, paralyzing the creature and stopping its heart. Max prodded it with the butt of his spear, half expecting it to spring to life and strike him down. But it didn't move. It was over, or so he thought. A low vibration rippled through the ground beneath his feet, so subtle at first that he almost dismissed it. Then it came again, stronger this time. Max froze, his eyes darting around the jungle. The silence was shattered by the distant, guttural cries of something large, many somethings. It hit him like a blow to the chest. The apex wasn't the only one of its kind. The realization was both terrifying and galvanizing. If more predators were coming, the colony didn't stand a chance. Max knew he had to act fast. Retrieving his datapad from his belt, he began frantically logging everything he had observed about the apex, its weaknesses, its behavioral patterns, the traps that had worked. He didn't have much time, but every detail could mean the difference between survival and extinction. As he worked, the jungle seemed to close in around him. The cries of the approaching predators grew louder, their guttural echoes reverberating through the trees. Max's hands trembled, but he forced himself to focus. "This isn't just for me," he whispered, as if saying it aloud would make it true. "This is for all of us." The datapad beeped as he uploaded his findings to the colony's central database. With a swipe of his finger, he initiated a signal beacon, alerting any remaining survivors to evacuate and regroup at the nearest safe zone. The apex had been a warning, a glimpse of the planet's true dangers. If humanity was to survive Aerith 7, it would need to adapt just as the predators did. Max cast one last glance at the fallen creature, its massive frame now a testament to both his triumph and his fear. He felt no pride, only a heavy sense of responsibility. The jungle hadn't been conquered. It had simply allowed him to live another day. Clutching the spear tightly, Max began to move. Each step felt heavier than the last, but his resolve grew with every cry of the approaching predators. He wasn't a soldier, a hunter, or a leader. He was just Max Carter, a biologist from Earth who had no business surviving in a place like this. And yet he had. The jungle swallowed him as he disappeared into its depths, his mind already racing with plans. He would survive the night, warn the others, and prepare for the next encounter. Because if humanity was the galaxy's weakest creature, it would have to fight like one, unyielding, resourceful, and unwilling to be erased.